Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our Ask the Expert webinar on protecting and investing in the water workforce through COVID-19 and beyond. My name is Savannah Bekowski, and I work at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. We have a great session lined up for you today, but first there are a few logistics to cover. During the webinar, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time throughout the session. Our expert will be providing contact information, so you can also contact him directly after the broadcast with any questions. But please feel free to submit them throughout the session, and we will be answering all those questions in a Q&A at the end of the presentation. We will be posting the presentation as well as a video recording on our website. You can reach that website at the link in the bottom left corner, efcnetwork.org. You will also be receiving a follow-up email that includes links to all of these materials. We do not submit our webinars to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. We do provide certificates of attendance as a courtesy. It can take 1 to 2 weeks to send out these certificates of attendance, and you must attend this entire webinar to receive one. You must have joined this webinar using the unique join link that was emailed to you when you registered. So that's how we count your attendance. We cannot guarantee that this webinar will meet requirements for a specific CEU or licensing renewal needs, but if you have any questions about this, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. And for a little bit about us here in the Environmental Finance Center Network, our program provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all US states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that we have centers and partner organizations spread across the country for this year's programming. We work together to create solutions for difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. And on that note, I would like to introduce our speaker for today's session. We have Joe Kane. He is the Senior Research Associate and Associate Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. And we also have joining us today, Chris Dotson as our Q&A facilitator. Chris is the Associate Director at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. So Joe, I pass everything over to you and welcome.
Perfect, thanks Savannah. And hi everyone, so happy to be able to present this afternoon. Hopefully you all can see the slides, everything, the technology is deciding to cooperate, but I'm sure Savannah will let me know if something doesn't work here. Anyway, I'm excited to go over some research that I've been doing for some time on the water workforce, which some of you may have seen in the past few years, but in particular at this moment of just sort of unprecedented uncertainty, looking at the essential workforce or the essential workers that we hear a lot about in the news. And so maybe just to take a step back before getting into any of the research that I've done, and I do want to leave plenty of time for conversation and questions, because I learned quite a bit from folks like yourselves who are attending today of what you're dealing with, and that really helps inform my work and really a lot of the solutions I think that could be happening here. But I'm gonna just take a minute to introduce sort of myself and Brookings if you're not familiar with that. So I'm specifically within the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. So Brookings is a 100-year-old think tank, primarily focusing on economic research based in Washington. But the work that I focus on is a lot of state and local economic development issues, particularly centered around infrastructure, and in this case, water infrastructure. And so when I say water infrastructure, as you'll see in this presentation, that includes drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, green infrastructure, gray infrastructure, kind of the full gamut of different water infrastructure issues. And so by background, I'm an economist and primarily a labor economist. And so I'm not an engineer, but I'm very interested in looking at this intersection between infrastructure and economic development. So in other words, what are some of the investment challenges that communities are facing around their water infrastructure? Where should some of these investments be prioritized? And how do we think of not just the physical infrastructure needs, which are very large and real in many places, and of course can vary from larger urban systems to smaller rural systems. But how do we think of people in this mix too? That we're not just focusing on the physical, but also the human capital that's so important to actually getting and operating all of our water infrastructure. So that's really a focus of my work and a motivation for this essential worker research. And I don't think too many of us at this point, since we've been inside, just reading probably a lot of different news and stories of what is or isn't happening. We know, of course, that millions of workers across the country, even just this morning, another 2+ million were on unemployment claims. So I think we're up to 39 million have lost their jobs in the past couple months. But we know that on the other side of that equation, there are many different types of essential workers. And I think some of these workers are more visible than others. Obviously those in hospital and healthcare settings, those in grocery stores, whether you're receiving a package, as many of us are now, in terms of truck drivers and delivery drivers, and then even other public works workers and those who are involved in transportation and other types of infrastructure. So there's many different types of essential workers, but I think there's still a lot of confusion of just who these workers are, how many of them there are, where they're actually concentrated in different places across the country. And so that really drove a lot of my interest here, which worked off of, if some of you have heard of it, the Department of Homeland Security actually received a directive to determine just who are essential infrastructure workers across the country. This was back in March, and as you can see here, quite literally, their directive was to define those who are protecting their communities while ensuring continuity of functions critical to public health and safety, as well as economic and national security. So this is a huge definition, kind of an impossible task in my opinion, in terms of just defining and counting just how many workers are involved here. And so, what we did at Brookings, and me and one of my other colleagues, is try to better define just in specific industries and specific occupations, who are these workers? And as you'd imagine, and I'll get into in a second, includes, of course, water infrastructure workers. And so, I guess I just point to two findings, not to get into too many stats, because I have enough stats later in the presentation, but scale matters here, where we found through our research that according to this expansive DHS definition, there's anywhere from 49 to 62 million people working in essential industries. So it's about 34 to 43% of the total workforce, which seems enormous, but makes sense when you think that a lot of people don't have the luxury, of just working from home or in other types of positions, that we might be more accustomed to, that we really do, economically speaking, and in terms of our public health, depend on millions of workers across the country. But I think beyond, these macro sort of indicators of just, counting jobs and just how many of these workers are across the country, I think one of the more important stats to bear in mind here is just sort of the nature of the work and who these workers are individually. And so again, looking at sort of the occupations, as you'll see in a second, can be very, very informative and I think reveal just how many of these workers are exposed to hazards on the job, just either through face-to-face interactions with other workers. Many may not have benefits or as many benefits as other workers. Some may be lower paid in particular, earning less than that national median wage of about $18.58 per hour. And so this has huge policy implications, not only in Washington, when it comes to various stimulus proposals and all of that, but also at a state and local level, and even among employers and workers themselves, of how can they be protected in this very uncertain environment. So I'll just run through some top level charts. You can find all this information on the Brookings website. So, I won't go into too much detail of everything that's here, but this scatter plot shows you just there are about over 100 different industries that we determined are essential. And it shows here, the x-axis, the bottom of just how many workers are employed in each of these industries, and then the y-axis or the vertical axis showing sort of the median hourly wage, and highlighting, you can see here hospitals and food and beverage stores, employing over 3 million and 6 million workers each. But you can see that many of these industries or the workers in these industries are earning below median pay, which has significant implications for the ability, economically speaking, for workers to be resilient during this time. Now, we also know that essential workers, and again, this includes not just water infrastructure workers, but again, other types of workers in these industries, they're all over the country. I think a lot of attendees today are tuning in from New York, but probably in some other markets too. But you can see in New York, if you remember, about 34% is the national share. So in New York, you can see it's actually even higher than that in many markets. So even 35, 40% or beyond. So there is no geographic exclusivity to these workers. They're all over the place. They should be a concern from a public policy perspective for every region across the country. And this last chart here, I know this is a lot of information, but it just simply shows, if you look on the left, again, the specific types of workers in these industries. So you think of nurses or home health aides or firefighters or bus drivers or plumbers, as you can see, which I'll describe in a second, are an important water occupation. There are hundreds of thousands of these workers across the country. You can see that their wages can vary quite a bit. Some are higher than that national median, although many can be lower. So you might hear in Amazon warehouses, for packagers. That's why there's a lot of concerns. The pay isn't great, the conditions aren't great. And so we're seeing a lot of potential hazards there. But I want to point your attention to sort of the last three columns in this table of sort of the shares of these workers that basically are exposed to, COVID-related issues, whether it's being in close proximity to others, being exposed to just general sort of germs and disease, and then face-to-face interactions. And so this not only, as you would expect, includes like nurses, right, because of the nature of their work, almost all of them are doing this every day, just being on the front lines of this, but also workers who you might think are more solitary and are less visible, and I think this is especially true in the water sector. They're often with their colleagues, they're with their coworkers, and they are exposed to hazards too. And so in as much as a lot of the reporting has focused on sort of these higher visibility positions, to tell this story, I think it's crucial we don't overlook some of these less visible workers that, as we all know, are just so important to making sure that we can all stay safe, healthy, and productive ongoing here. So, given that context of just essential workers overall, water workers are of course a big part of this equation, and so this builds again off some previous research I had done. Some of you may have seen this. Came out a couple years ago on just who are water workers, and as you can see here, as I define them, they include those who are directly involved in construction, operation, design, and governance of the country's various water systems. And so again, this includes drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, et cetera. So really the full gamut of water workers across the country. And a top level finding here, which I think relates back well to the essential worker conversation, is that there's millions, 1.7 million of these water workers found across 212 different occupations. And so, they're spanning many different types of industries. These workers, what I like to emphasize, they're not just in utilities, although utilities are a big employer. There are also hundreds of thousands of these workers employed in engineering firms, in other parts of local government, and other parts of the economy. And so there really are, a vital piece to our, not just our water infrastructure of making sure that's all performing well, but really to our larger economy too, and really recognizing their economic importance for many different reasons. This is just to provide an example of what some of these larger occupations are here, and it's to say, you know, that of course you have water operators and technicians who might be more in the skilled trades, but also not overlooking the many different types of workers that are involved in administrative and management, or even finance and human resources. And so, of course, these workers, depending on the specific duties they carry out every day, can very much affect their exposure, you know, in a period that we're in right now, where if you're an office worker, you may have a greater ability to work from home or work remotely or have more flexible hours. But we know that some of these workers, of course, as part of emergency response plans and other tactics, you know, they have to be on site, they have to be on the job. And so, you know, recognizing that and how that can vary across the sector, I think is important. And then including sort of the response in which we can better protect these workers and invest in them, I think is important. What I want to point out is, in terms of the characteristics of water jobs, unlike some other jobs that are found among other essential workers, is fortunately many water occupations, this is across the whole country, so this may not be true for every region or for every system, but most water workers tend to earn competitive wages, especially if you look at the left-hand side of this chart at that 10th and 25th percentile. So in other words, water workers that are really at the lower ends of the income spectrum here. So those who may be just starting out their careers, may not have a lot of experience, they tend to earn more competitive wages than they would otherwise in other types of occupations that we see across the country, including in retail trade, including in other customer service occupations that are more commonly filled by many different people across the country. So, you know, when we think of the economic advantages of the workers in these positions, it's crucial that we think not only of how they're able to respond to the moment, right, of how they're protected and have the certainty and getting the pay that they deserve for these types of activities, but also how can the water workforce represent, which I'll describe in a second, how can it represent a key enabler for long-term economic opportunity that as we get past sort of the adaptation and the immediate response to COVID-19 or any sort of pandemic situation, you know, we're in a recession. And so how can our infrastructure, and in particular our water infrastructure and our water workers, be a lever for economic growth and opportunity, I think is something to consider. So again, as I just said, you know, we know that water workers are supporting our communities right now. They've always supported them. That hasn't changed in this situation. But I think that the question is, of course, now how can we support them to drive long-term opportunity for really our communities and for the country. And so I'll just point to a few more stats here. But you know, I think this is probably obvious to many of us. But you know, water workers, like many other types of infrastructure workers, tend to need less formal education to qualify for their positions. And you can see here that actually more than half, you know, have a high school diploma or below. And so when we think of the types of workers just nationally who aren't even in, you know, water infrastructure or the infrastructure workforce or skilled trades, there are many workers right now who are losing jobs, who do not have a lot of education, tend to be lower income. You know, this could potentially be a pathway, you know, not just sort of creating a short-term job for the sake of creating a job, but really creating a durable career pathway for more people is important to consider. But we also know that it's not just formal education, of course. You know, a lot of water workers need extensive work experience and on-the-job training. We know apprenticeships, pre-apprenticeships, you know, continued skills acquisition, skills development as they grow their careers. So it's not just about filling entry-level opportunities, but really, again, creating that durable bench of talent to fill this workforce over time is important. And so this is this is going to be an ongoing consideration. I know it has been, and it doesn't change with our current, COVID moment. But really, how are workers going to be receiving the training and honestly the workforce development in this sector, given some of the new realities we're facing, but even the realities we were facing before this pandemic, where I think there have been some struggles in the water sector to filling these positions, at least quickly and reliably, and not in ways that kind of are ad hoc or by word of mouth, which has been often the tradition, unfortunately, for many smaller systems in particular across the country, where there are just significant challenges filling these positions. And why is that? And I don't think I need to get into too much detail, because I think probably many people on the webinar are familiar with this. We're amidst a silver tsunami at the moment. Just looking at water treatment operators, that the median age is 46 years versus 42 years for all workers nationally. So we have an aging water workforce. And on the other end of sort of this pipeline, you can see that only about 10% of water workers versus 12% for all workers nationally are even below 24 years of age. And so, the sort of the end of the pipeline is very full in many places, and the beginning of the pipeline is very empty. And so there's, again, this opportunity, I think, to hiring, training, and retention, to helping more types of workers grow their water careers. And I can't see a better moment than now to start, to keep thinking about that, not just start thinking about it, but to keep thinking about that. Another consideration here too, that again is not the case across every system. So these are just national statistics that aggregate a lot of different characteristics across different systems. But we tend to see a lack of diversity, racial diversity in many water positions across the country, where you can see among Black and Asian workers in particular, the shares in the water sector tend to be lower than they are for all other types of jobs nationally. Interestingly, you can see in terms of Hispanic workers, actually the share is higher. Although, as I've said before, and if you've read the report that I've done, this is because a lot of those Hispanic workers are employed in construction-related jobs, and so there are still questions of connecting more and different types of folks with not just sort of, again, those entry-level, short-term perhaps opportunities, but really long-term pathways to growing their careers and really achieving greater certainty through engineering positions, managerial positions, which have to be a consideration here too. So, in terms of all right, well, yeah, there's this kind of this need to protect water workers in this current moment we're in, but there's also this opportunity to invest in them. I'm also not short-sighted in understanding that, especially among many state and local and municipal folks, that there are many other hurdles and challenges at the moment, many uncertainties in terms of even where the revenue is going to come in to pay for different projects, let alone keep taking on more debt to pay for projects, to beyond even thinking of the workforce challenges. There's just a lot on people's plates. And so in this aim to create both safe and enduring career pathways for a variety of current and prospective workers, I usually start with the local actions, sort of, you can see number 3 here of, what can utilities and employers do to address these challenges. But to me, I really do think a lot of the action that's needed here is national and state level. I just think there has to be a recognition that there is a lack of capacity to address a lot of this at the moment, and I worry, given some of the bleeding, I fear that a lot of states and localities are going to feel in the months to come. It's going to be very hard in a budgetary way to take on a lot of this responsibility. And so there have been proposals in Washington, around, you've probably heard, on essential workers, on assisting states and localities to help make up some of this shortfall. I think, that hopefully that those conversations can continue. Usually, probably like many of you, I'm not too hopeful, that Washington will often do something right, especially in an election year. But I do think that the urgency is there, both politically and economically. So I do think there is potential on that. I'm happy to talk about that more if there was interest. I do though not want to overlook. You see points 2 and 3 here of what some of the regional actions can be, and again, what some of the utility and local employer actions can be to address some of these workforce challenges. I mean, at the end of the day, utilities and other workers are fundamentally local entities. They vary tremendously in their capacity, both fiscally and but also technically and organizationally to take on some of these challenges. And it's going to be up to continued partnerships and collaborations at a regional and at a state level with workforce groups, with educational institutions, with social service organizations to connect to the opportunities of helping younger workers, for example, even realize there are careers in this space, students, other prospective workers, and then hopefully not overlooking reskilling and retraining efforts for workers who may be detached right now from some of these opportunities, including veterans, including the out of work. I think unfortunately, given that we're up now to 38 million unemployed across the country, probably many of them are not going to be able to make a quick switch or would want to make a quick switch into an infrastructure career per se, but I do think there is an opportunity to continue to raise the visibility and hopefully gain traction through some of these positions. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was a lot of information, and I actually went even longer than I wanted to. but I'm really looking forward to any questions and conversation. So Savannah, did you want to take it over again, or Chris?
Yeah, I'm here to. So for those of you on the webinar, my name is Chris Dodson. I'm the Associate Director of the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and I will be reading some questions off that you guys are submitting through the questions box. So if you have any additional questions, put them in there now, and that's essentially how we'll spend the remainder of our time. So one question is, Joe, and I don't know if you really, what kind of answer you might have here, if there's resources, but the question came out like, we all understand social distancing, masks 6 feet apart. Obviously in the water realm, like water operators, distribution guys can't always be 6 feet apart. Are there other recommended protection measures that you're aware of?
Yeah, it's a good question. I usually like to say that I am not a public health expert. So I'm as curious in understanding honestly, what some utilities, for example, might be doing about this right now. I think that's where I've seen the interest, is that there is no uniform answer to this. And there hasn't been, to my understanding at least, very consistent guidance all across the country of what should or shouldn't be done. And I think that's led to a lot of confusion, not just in the water sector, but in, of course, other types of industries. But where I've seen the interest and the appetite is, what are other places doing about this, kind of in lieu of this consistent, national and federal guidance. You can see what CDC says, right, which is like, well, just kind of work from home, and that's not going to work for a lot of these workers. And of course, at least those workers who are in utilities, I mean, there have been certain emergency response plans in place. So in some ways, I'd say utilities have been better positioned for this type of situation than perhaps some other sectors of the economy at the moment, which, as we all know, whether restaurants, entertainment, hospitality, I mean, those industries have completely been upended with no clear end in sight. And so where I've looked for is, I've seen, and I'm sure some folks who are listening in have even better information. So I'd encourage them to share that in the chat box if they've heard anything. But I've seen in places such as Atlanta, not just the water utility, but in terms of all civic works, other types of public employees, offering opportunities for hazard pay, for paid sick leave where it makes sense, where it's possible. That may not be possible for some of these employees, obviously, given just the truly essential nature of the work they're carrying out. But I think it's kind of all hands on deck, finding what tools and arrangements make the most sense. And I think if anything, when we think of what are the longer term steps that can be taken here, I mean, there needs to be a deep bench of talent ready to go, to fill these positions ongoing, because many systems, from my experience, just again, not just in smaller rural communities, but even in urban communities and larger systems too, they were already lacking, kind of the sub or the replacement person to come in. And so, when you don't have that safety net or that backstop, if a worker did become sick, I mean, that has to be a concern, in terms of operations. So, but that's not going to be a short-term save here. So I don't really have a good answer for the 6 feet or 6 feet apart question, but I'd be curious to hear what others are even thinking around that, or Chris, if you've heard anything.
No, I haven't, and I'd be curious as well. And folks, just to remind you, if you have questions, drop them in the question box. And also, if you have any ideas based on the last question or anything else you'd like to share, you can drop those things in either the question or the chat box, and Savannah, Joe, and I will be sure to check them out. So I guess this question's slightly related, but probably more broad. What kind of possible federal policy response, let me restart that again. What would be a possible federal policy response to protecting water utility and other essential workers during and after this pandemic?
Yeah, I think what I've heard and seen, and again, this isn't just exclusive to the water sector, but I think, again, given those certainly those financial difficulties that are already here, have been here, and are probably going to become even more pronounced, certainly some type of assistance, direct assistance, grants, probably not just loans, from the federal government, I think would be welcome. Not just to address, workforce concerns. There are obviously other operational concerns, capital projects, that probably have to get done in different places. And so, that I would think is an obvious place to start. Of course, federal resources aren't infinite. The first stimulus was over $2 trillion, which is, again, sort of unprecedented even compared to ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, from 10 plus years ago, which at that time we thought was huge. This is, just the first stimulus bill that passed here was more than twice the level of ARRA, and I think we're still kind of at the beginning days of this, where, I don't think it's a question of if there's going to be another package. I think it's more a question of when, and of course there's the political domino effects of what is or isn't possible, and what can be negotiated on the Hill. It's fortunately a world that I don't have to be in the middle of every day. But I think there are some reservations of, how much money could go towards these types of efforts. And so I primarily think in terms of the money side here, getting it out the door to help places that really, the states and the localities that are probably better equipped to really deploying those resources, hopefully. And then beyond that, I do think that, it is never too soon to think of the long-term opportunities here as well. So again, not just sort of all right, what do we do in the next few months, but really, how are we going to really get stronger from this moment, not just sort of shy away from it and try to survive it, but we've been dealing with some of these workforce issues for some time. There are, of course, many other public service and economic issues that have to be addressed, particularly around the out of work, those who have fallen sick, unemployment insurance. The list is very long of other things that have to be done. But I think, certainly additional federal leadership around apprenticeships, work-based learning, I think is a no-brainer. I know there have been conversations in terms of national service even. So the core network, if some folks are familiar with that, how do we as a country think of this moment, especially among younger detached workers, how do they potentially get involved in careers, in this space, both in terms of, traditional water careers, but even those that are more tied to the environment. And how can that potentially happen? I mean, we do have a precedent for that, the Civilian Conservation Corps going back to the Great Depression and the New Deal. I do think that there is some political appetite for something like that. And even when you talk about dollar signs, I think, relatively speaking, less, even just a little bit more money for an effort like that could make a huge, huge difference for many different types of people and communities across the country. So that's how I would think about it, is in the short term, how can the resources from the feds get down to states and localities so they can deploy it quickly? I think time is of the essence here, but then also not losing sight of how can infrastructure, and in particular water infrastructure, be at the head of this economic response in terms of the recovery.
All right, thank you. Another question, this one is from Steve Sanders. Can you talk a little more about how local utilities may be able to take advantage of connecting the number of unemployed with the potential career paths in the water sector? Go Water Tigers.
Hey, Stephen. Yeah, no, I appreciate you listening in. Yeah, look, and Stephen probably could answer this even better than me, to give him full credit. It can't just be up to utilities, right, doing this alone, or even just organizations and networks like NOEA and the Environmental Finance Center Network. I mean, those actors should be leading the charge and should be having the conversations here, which I know they already are, and I really applaud you all, and probably many of you who are on the call, for taking the lead and really being proactive, I think, in just talking about these issues, which for so long, not to point the finger of any blame, but just for so long just weren't really one of the first priorities in this sector. And so having those conversations, those collaborations as a starting point is huge, and that hasn't happened all across the country. There often just isn't, quite frankly, enough time, staffing capacity to even do that. You have to have buy-in from leadership at a local level. That's a little hard to recommend, that you need to have a good leader, but it does matter, in terms of the operating culture, the willingness to kind of have these new conversations. And I think that especially relates to, as Stephen's bringing up, relating to new and different types of people and communities who may not even realize the opportunities in this space. And so that, that to me means that, utilities can't just be shying away from this issue and seeing it as a challenge and just, another budgetary item, but really need to be seen as I like to think of it, and others, who are thinking about these issues, of utilities being sort of anchor institutions in their communities. We look at our libraries, our educational institutions, our hospitals as core anchor institutions, but I mean, water utilities are right there too. Yet they often lack the visibility. That's sometimes intentional, not to get extra attention, just getting the service going, keeping everything smooth. But I do think there's an opportunity to really collaborate more with, again, some of these other actors who don't even know that water matters, from a workforce perspective. When we think of workforce investment boards, when we think of certain educational institutions, and not just, four-year colleges, but community colleges, and there are some great programs and collaborations already in place, too many to name across the country. But again, in some places that isn't happening. There are other groups that, as I mentioned before, who focus more on veterans issues, that focus on even formerly incarcerated individuals who are looking for another opportunity. So creating those flexible pathways and ways in which different types of community partners can come together to address these challenges, I think is a no-brainer. And if anything, that takes a little time, but hopefully doesn't take a lot of money, to hold a meeting or have these new conversations, because unfortunately in many places those conversations haven't taken place. I think it'd be a little hard, obviously, right now with everyone working remotely, but maybe not. Maybe this is a good moment for some places to talk about this too. So I appreciate the question, Stephen.
All right. Just a reminder, a couple reminders. Drop your questions in if you have them. If we run out of time before we answer all these questions, then we will get answers to you later by email. I think we should be able to, but as the questions keep coming in, you never know. And also a reminder that this webinar will be recorded, so you can always go back and check it out on our website. So I got a question here regarding high school, like career and technical education programs. They require work-based learning opportunities for students. What are some ways that utilities can offer work-based learning to students under 18 years old?
It's a great question, yeah. And so there are actually some good models out there too. I encourage folks, I know I gave a plug for this before, but it's all free and online. So you might as well, if you want to read a PDF, a lot of people don't like to do that anymore, but if you do want to read a long report that I promise isn't too boring, there are a lot of good case studies. If you type up Brookings Water Workforce, that point to what some regions are already doing around this. 3 regions that I highlighted in that report are, and they're all different types of regions, because what's going to be true in New York, for example, could be different than what's in California or some other part of the country. But the 3 regions I highlighted were the Bay Area in California, Louisville, Kentucky, and then Camden, New Jersey, which I know is close enough to New York and has some interesting challenges and opportunities at play. But what all those regions have done is, especially for these younger workers who might be in high school even, having, again, community proactive outreach has been a big part of their strategies. Demonstration projects, particularly when it comes to new green infrastructure projects, of just making people in the community even be aware of that water isn't just something that's hidden away in some big treatment plant, but actually is integral to how we think about and design our communities. A lot of people don't think about that, even though they might live literally right next to a treatment plant. So having those demonstration projects, I think, is an easy way to connect with the community in terms of actually exposing individuals to specific opportunities in this space. I think one aspect that isn't mentioned enough but should be are mentorships. So talk a lot about internships, like summer internships, job shadowing opportunities. Those are all very important. Pre-apprenticeships, bridge programs can all expose younger workers to opportunities in this space. But the challenge is, how do you keep those younger workers and students actually latched onto and connected to the system, and often independently on their own, if they happen to work with someone who they were really impressed with or learned a lot from via their internship or somewhere else, they'll stay in touch with that current water worker, right? And so that's a value add. And you think about it for any career. If you have a model to follow, you have an understanding of who they are as a person, in addition to just the work they're doing and the skills you need. I mean, a lot of what water workers do, and I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit, it's not just hard technical skills. A lot of it's soft skills. I mean, are you a good communicator? Are you a good collaborator with your fellow workers? That's a big part of it, to understand who are the people actually in this sector. So mentorships and making sure those mentorships can continue, I think, is is another area that hopefully could make a difference.
Great, thank you. Another question. Should a town public works pay hazard pay to its water and sewer department?
Yeah, I knew this was coming. And I somewhat, to be transparent, kind of sidestep in at least the research I've done on specifically, how much hazard pay and the duration of that hazard pay. It's a sticky topic, and especially when it comes to the public sector, which of course, at this moment is very cash strapped. I mean, there are not a lot of resources in a lot of places to go around because of balanced budget requirements and so forth. And so, but these workers are putting their, I don't think it's an exaggeration, they are putting their lives on the line to protect all of us. And so I think, I'm not a philosopher, but I do think there is an ethical responsibility a little bit here to recognizing that and providing some support where it's possible or it makes sense. And this is why, again, I think, those federal resources would be important here of just as it's made a difference in terms of unemployment insurance, sort of making up some of that gap. I think, there's a definite federal responsibility, not just all on the shoulders of a locality that is really stretched thin at the moment. But I also don't want to make it sound like it's just up to local government either. I mean, a lot of these workers are in the private sector, contractors, other types of firms, and in some other sectors of the economy. I mean, we've seen quote unquote hero pay come across. Some people may have heard of in Kroger and grocery stores. They offer an extra maybe $2 or $3 an hour, which it's like you think to yourself, that's not going to make a huge difference, but it could, realistically for some workers who are not maybe making a lot of money, and any extra certainty they can get is better than nothing. But you may have also seen some of those hazard pay additions are now being phased out because the employers just don't have the capacity. And so, like, my heart says that hazard pay is a no-brainer, should be done, should be to protect workers, but my head also says resources aren't infinite. It's a difficult balance. There are a lot of priorities, obviously, like, and so I sympathize with the difficulty of balancing that. I will just say it's something that is coming up a lot at a national, federal level, and so my hope is that there can be support from there.
All right, thank you. I just want to let everybody know the report that Joe was referencing, I dropped a web link into the chat box for you, so you guys can just go and cut and paste that link or click on it now, whatever you'd like to do, but it's there for you as a resource. Next question. I think maybe the first part of this was a little bit discussed already with Steve Sanders' question, but what actions are currently being taken to improve visibility that water utility workers are essential and promoting recognition both publicly and through increased pay across the industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I'd love to, because I certainly don't have all, I don't have all the answers of what all different types of places are doing around this at the moment. I think, as much as there can be any action around visibility, and I don't even know how much it's intentional as much as just people, it's weird. I don't want to. I mean, I'd be curious, Chris, and Savannah, what you think about this, but we're all home, right? And everyone's like, you got to wash your hands and, you got to stay like healthy. It's like, well, you got to have running water for that, right? And I don't know how much, sort of internally I at least do beyond just studying this stuff, but like, on a day-to-day basis, the recognition of the fact that we all depend on water. If it got turned off, what would we do? Same thing with broadband, right? I mean, if we didn't have broadband or reliable internet connection, we couldn't be doing what we're doing right now. So there are just a certain essential, infrastructure services that I think a lot of people, just because of the moment we're in, have become more visible just because of how we're living at the moment. So that's probably helped. Now, I think the key though is how do we get past sort of, again, sort of the physical infrastructure of, all right, yeah, like I need running water, I need it to be safe, but how do I begin to think of the people, you know, who do that, and water perhaps, you know, more so than any infrastructure sector, and I'd argue even a lot of other just essential workers across the whole economy, they're very invisible. And that's partly just because of the nature of the work they do, where it can be solitary, it can be dirty. A lot of people don't really think about it or don't even want to think about it. And so, you know, credit again to organizations like WEF, NWEA, you know, the other AWWA, NACWA, the full alphabet soup of water associations. I know I've done a very good job in terms of outreach, in terms of various social media, to really spotlight, you know, the stories around some of these workers. You know, you can cite a lot of stats like I do, which I think helps, you know, when reaching sort of that policymaker audience of, hey, water workers matter. But when it comes to sort of this broader, you know, public audience, and I include, you know, in that a lot of local leadership and state leadership in some places that don't really prioritize water as much. I mean, you know, telling those stories of what individual workers are doing, I think is so powerful, and needs to be done more of that. So I would stress, you know, as many folks who are listening in today who have stories to tell from workers in their community, tell them, you know, get them out there. I know I, for one, would be interested in hearing them, you know, and that's part of, you know, Brookings has a good platform for that. I'd love to shine more light on those examples. Not promising I see there are literally I think a couple hundred people on this webinar, so I don't know if I can feature all of those stories, but I would love to hear some of those, and I think that would be a good start too to raising visibility.
Great. Just to add to that, I'm the vice president-elect, or vice president, sorry, of NIWEA, the New York Water and Environment Association. And together with the New York section of AWWA, we put together a letter last week. This week is Public Works Week, for those of you who don't know. And so we've been noticing, you know, all the thanking of all the frontline workers, and we consider people in the water industry to be frontline workers for reasons that Joe's already outlined. So we put together a letter, we sent it to all of the local elected officials that we had good contact for, reminded them that it was Public Works Week, and asked them maybe they could do a few things. So here's a couple of ideas that we listed for them. Write a letter to the editor of the local newspaper, reminding them of the value of water operators. Post a thank you prominently on your website and other social media platforms. That said, WEF, I think, created a filter for Facebook that you can put over your Facebook profile. So I changed my Facebook profile with the hashtag #WaterIsWorthIt, just for this week anyway. Place a thank you on your municipal signboard, arrange for local media to cover a stories like Joe's suggesting he's interested in hearing, acknowledge them with a thank you, put like a political sign, you know, in front of the the treatment plant, you know, that says, you know, one of those yard signs that says, thank you, you're valued, water's worth it. These are the types of things we suggested that local governments do. Whether they're doing it or not, I don't know, but you know, these are ways that we really want to make sure these critically important roles and jobs are being valued. So that's just something I wanted to add. We have a few minutes left. Let me get back to a couple of other questions. Okay, if federal money comes available to small rural communities for infrastructure and plant upgrades / replacements, what will they be looking for to categorize the places that need the most help? So probably prioritization there. Example, a utility with an asset management program in place that categorizes the asset's conditions, median household income, meeting EPA compliance. What things should a utility be looking to focus on?
Yeah, it's probably, I should say too, because I know we're running close to the hour here, but I can keep going. I guess it's the beauty of kind of these webinars. But I should say to folks, and Chris, you may be mentioning this, folks should feel free to email me with questions. My email's on the presentation, but it's jkane, Jkane, @brookings.edu. So you should feel free to shoot me questions if you have them. I think as it relates to this specific question, I see it as two ways. There's, partly a responsibility on the utility or the system to have, its financial house in order, or its asset management plan, et cetera, of what are the needs, what are the priorities, and then there's a whole other separate, shouldn't be separate, but it's on a different level of to what extent, how would the federal side of this begin to make these sorts of decisions? And I don't think I need to say to folks, the reality that we're in, or has been for decades, has been a pullback in federal support, or at least direct support for water infrastructure. Reliance on SRFs and loans. WIFIA, of course, is like a new model. But there really hasn't been a lot of tremendous direct support via the federal side, and so I know something that a few things that I'll be thinking about that I think are challenges for smaller systems, but again, larger systems too. I don't like to always categorize rural and small as being lacking capacity and not good, because there are some small systems that are doing good stuff, and so it's important to get those stories out there of not just sort of the failures, but also the best practices of what's getting done, given sort of constrained, limited resources, and amidst other challenging economic conditions and declining populations in some places. And so, I think affordability is always, a concern here of how our system's balancing the investment needs against the affordability concerns. Just simply increasing rates, is not really a feasible option in many cases. Taking on a ton of new debt may not be an option, even though the muni bond market at the moment is, very advantageous. And for those who are following a lot of, infrastructure finance at the moment, I mean, the Federal Reserve has a new program they've established that's helping states and localities address some of these issues. So there are some additional federal avenues that are already happening to build capacity at a local level that are very nascent. Still, I think a lot of people are getting their bearings of what's the potential of these platforms, but they are happening. But I would look at affordability. I would look at balancing affordability concerns with investment concerns, and to whatever extent, these other sort of operational issues around workforce, new types of projects, that can boost efficiency, new technologies, that should all be a consideration, but there has to be, of course, prioritization and understanding from the utility too of what needs to get done.
One last question I think we have time for. I also think it may have been partially addressed earlier, but we have aging infrastructure in water and wastewater, and both sides of the aisle in Congress have agreed that infrastructure funding is necessary. Now we need jobs. Do you think we'll see increased federal funding to upgrade our systems and create construction jobs?
Yeah, look, infrastructure historically has been bipartisan. You can go back to the Obama administration, you can go back to the first Bush administration, the Eisenhower administration, which was really, I would argue, the last time we truly had a great push nationally with the interstate highway era, for really a true national infrastructure push across the country. So that's, we're looking at almost 70 years ago. There have been plans put forth, well, I'm sure many people are familiar with from the Trump administration, plans put forth by the Democrats in the House, plans like there is not a lack of plans. The problem has been the lack of money, usually, and I would say even beyond the money has been the lack of vision. Often we go straight to the dollar signs around this stuff and just say, well, we just throw more money at it, it'll solve everything. And I'd say the needs are bigger than that. The needs are, I would argue we don't have a 21st century vision for infrastructure across the country, which I think workers should be at the top or near the top of that vision and that plan, to the extent that infrastructure is not just an enabler for itself, but it's an enabler for economic growth, opportunity, environmental sustainability, everything. And so construction jobs, are a part of that in terms of like short-term stimulus. I'll say in Washington at the moment, there's a hesitation to kind of repeat the tactic 10 years ago of shovel-ready jobs, which I think were not very well defined. I think there was an overemphasis on just construction jobs, and a point that I like to emphasize is really more on operation and maintenance. I mean, that's really that's what's needed here is as a platform for more workers to take on careers in this space, so they're going to be around for hopefully decades to come. So we're making those generational investments in infrastructure as well as those generational investments in workers. And so right now, I think there's still a possibility in a stimulus package for infrastructure to be part of that. It was talked about by House Majority Leader Pelosi for the second stimulus about a month ago. Then 2 days later, it was totally off the table. But it still keeps coming up among congressional leaders. And of course, in the administration, infrastructure is always there. So I see there being an opening in one of these. I do think there's going to be probably, if not one more, perhaps multiple stimulus packages coming. And then depending on what happens with the presidential election this fall, there could be opportunities following that heading into next year.
All right, thanks, Joe. That's all the time that we have. So for those of you who are still on, if you go to the chat box, you can find his report and his email. Savannah, any last words?
No, I just want to thank both you and Joe for being here today to provide your expertise. And for folks on the line, you will be receiving a follow-up email that includes links to all of the materials and resources that we talked about today.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe and Savannah, and thank you to all of you who participated in this webinar today. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You too.